Welcome back to Justice Insight Cam. We bring you unfiltered, real-world police interactions recorded straight from body cameras. Moving beyond the video, we analyze the facts, legal boundaries, and critical takeaways from each case. Let us explore the reality of justice.
All right, sir. What are you doing here? This isn't your place.
I'm moving in. I showed you the lease already.
You're fake. He doesn't live here.
Yeah, we think so too. You're coming with us.
Hold up. Say that again. I'm your boss, dumbass.
When Deborah Lane saw a black man carrying boxes into her apartment building, she didn't contact building management. She didn't ask a single polite question. Instead, she walked straight up to him and told him that someone like you could not possibly live there. When Malcolm Rivers calmly explained that he was her new neighbor, she dismissed him outright and warned that she was calling the police, because in her words, a black man like you doesn't belong here. What she didn't know was that the black man she was accusing of not belonging was the city's new police chief, and that her racism was about to unravel her life. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe moving into your own home while black shouldn't require proving your innocence, then like this video and subscribe. Malcolm Rivers pulled up to Westbrook Apartments at 9:30 on a Saturday morning with a moving truck parked outside and an open weekend ahead of him. At 47 years old, Rivers had spent 22 years working his way through every rank the Houston Police Department offered, and 3 weeks ago, he had been appointed the city's new police chief, a position he would officially occupy starting Monday morning. Today was moving day. He had purchased the apartment 6 weeks earlier, signed the deed, completed every piece of paperwork that came with owning property, and arranged for the moving company to deliver his furniture later in the afternoon. For now, he was doing the first trips himself, boxes of books, kitchen items, personal belongings that he preferred to handle without help. Rivers was dressed the way anyone dresses to move on a Saturday morning. Dark jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, clean sneakers. He looked relaxed and unhurried because he was. After 22 years of pressure and responsibility and the particular weight of a career, spent navigating institutions that weren't always built for people who looked like him, a Saturday morning move into his own home felt genuinely peaceful. He carried the first box through the building entrance, took the elevator to the 4th floor, and walked down the hallway toward apartment 4C, the apartment whose deed was currently sitting in a folder on his kitchen counter, waiting for the day it would be needed. He went back to the truck for the second box, then the third. On his 4th trip through the hallway, he noticed a white woman standing near the elevator watching him. She was in her late 50s, wearing weekend clothes, arms crossed with the posture of someone who had appointed themselves in authority over their surroundings a long time ago. Her name was Deborah Lane, and she had lived in apartment 4A for 12 years. She watched Rivers walk past her with a box without saying anything. He nodded politely and continued to his door. On his 5th trip, she was still there. This time she stepped forward. "Excuse me," Lane said, her tone carrying the particular sharpness of someone who considers confrontation their right. "What exactly are you doing?" Rivers looked at the box in his hands, and then back at Lane with the patient expression of a man who has encountered this specific energy many times before. "I'm moving in," he said simply. Lane's eyes moved from Rivers to the box to the apartment door he'd been going in and out of, and her expression didn't change. Moving in, she repeated the words carrying disbelief. She wasn't bothering to hide. "Into this building, into apartment 4C, Rivers said, I'm your new neighbor." Lane let out a short sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a dismissal. "Someone like you cannot possibly be living here," she said. "I've been in this building for 12 years. I know everyone who moves in and out, and I have not been informed of any new tenant." "I'm not a tenant," River said calmly. I'm the owner. I purchased the apartment 6 weeks ago. Lane looked at him the way a person looks at something they've already decided is false. I don't believe that, she said flatly. And I don't know what you're actually doing here, but you look suspicious and I'm calling the police. Rivers looked at her steadily. Is it because I'm black? Lane met his eyes without flinching. Yes, she said. Exactly. Because you're black. A black man like you doesn't belong here. She pulled out her phone and began dialing while Rivers stood in the hallway of his own home, holding a box of his own belongings. Rivers set the box down carefully, leaned it against the wall, and said nothing more to Lane. He went back to the elevator, rode down to the truck, and continued moving. He could hear Lane's voice faintly from the 4th floor as he carried boxes. She was on the phone making the call, describing a suspicious black man in the building. Rivers carried 2 more boxes up and set them inside his apartment, moving with the same unhurried calm as before. He had 22 years of experience understanding how these situations unfolded, and he understood this one completely. 8 minutes after Lane's call, the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor and 2 uniformed officers stepped out. Officer Sean Whitaker came first, white, mid-40s, 15 years on the force, the kind of officer who walked into situations already knowing what he'd find. Officer Lucas Barrett was behind him, younger, early 30s, 3 years on the force, following Whitaker's lead, the way junior officers follow senior ones when they haven't yet developed the confidence to question what they're walking into. Lane was waiting near the elevator and pointed immediately in the direction of Rivers, who was standing in the hallway outside his apartment door, holding another box. That's him, she said. Whitaker walked toward Rivers with Barrett behind of him. Rivers watched them approach and set his box down, straightening up and giving them his full attention. What are you doing in this building? Whitaker asked, his tone carrying the same energy Lane had. The assumption of guilt presented his routine inquiry. Rivers looked at him with calm directness. I'm moving into apartment 4C. Is there a problem? We got a call about a suspicious individual in the building. Whitaker said, we need to verify that you actually live here. That's fine, Rivers said. Give me 1 moment. He opened his apartment door, went inside, and returned 30 seconds later with a knife holder. He opened it and handed Whitaker the deed to apartment 4C, registered in the name of Malcolm Rivers, along with his proof of ownership documentation showing the purchase was completed 6 weeks earlier. The paperwork was thorough, official, and completely legitimate. Whitaker took the documents and looked through them. Barrett looked over his shoulder from down the hallway. Lane watched with her arms crossed, and when Whitaker didn't immediately move to arrest River, she called out, "Those are probably fake. I've been here 12 years and I know when someone moves in and nobody told me anything about a black man buying into this building. Those documents are not real." Whitaker looked up from the papers and something shifted in his expression. The moment a man who has already made his decision finds the justification he needed. He looked at Rivers. She raises a fair point. These could be fraudulent documents. Rivers kept his voice even. They're not fraudulent. Everything in that folder is legitimate and verifiable. If you have any doubt, call the number printed on the deed. The building management company is listed right there. Call them and they'll confirm the purchase. Whitaker handed the documents back to Rivers and shook his head. If this deed is fake, why would we call a number printed on it? We're not going to do that. Rivers looked at him for a moment. So, you're refusing to verify the documents by contacting the issuing company. We need to verify everything at the station, Whitaker said. You need to come with us. I'm not going to any station, Rivers said. Clearly, I have just shown you my deed and my proof of ownership for this property. I have offered you a direct way to verify everything in 30 seconds. I know my rights, and I am standing in them right now." Barrett shifted his weight slightly, his eyes moving between Whitaker and Rivers, something in his expression suggesting a discomfort he wasn't prepared to voice in front of his senior officer. "You need to calm down," Whitaker said, his voice dropping to something more authoritative. "We told you those documents could be fake. We're not calling any number off a potentially fraudulent deed. You need to come with us to the station so we can sort this out properly." "You want to arrest me?" Rivers said. Even after I've shown you ownership documentation for this property, Whitaker didn't answer the question directly. "Turn around slowly and we'll get this sorted out at the station," he said, taking a step closer. Rivers looked at Whitaker, then at Barrett, then back at Whitaker. Both officers were moving now, closing the space between them and Rivers with the body language of men about to make an arrest. Rivers had shown them his deed. He had shown them his proof of ownership. He had offered them a way to verify everything in 30 seconds. They had dismissed all of it. He reached into his back pocket slowly, making sure both officers could see his hands clearly, and produced a leather badge wallet. He opened it and held it up so both officers could see the badge in the identification card behind the clear plastic window. Houston Police Department, Chief of Police, Malcolm Rivers. The hallway went completely silent. Whitaker stared at the badge. The color drained from his face almost instantly, like a man who had just watched his whole career start to collapse in front of him. Barrett took a small step backward without seeming to realize he'd done it. Both of them knew that badge. They had been receiving internal department memos for 2 weeks about the new chief starting, Monday. They had seen the name. They had seen the photograph, and they were standing in a hallway, having just attempted to arrest him after he showed them his deed. Lane's voice came from down the hallway, still defiant. "That badge is probably fake too." "Ma'am?" Whitaker's voice came out sharper than he intended as he cut her off, his eyes never leaving the badge in the Rivers' hand. Rivers closed the badge wallet and put it back in his pocket. He looked at Whitaker and then at Barrett with an expression that was completely composed and absolutely final. "I will see both of you in my office Monday morning," he said quietly. 8 a.m. Neither officer said anything. Rivers turned to Lane, who was standing down the hallway, looking for the first time like a woman who understood the weight of what she had said in motion. "You will be hearing from my attorney," he said simply. Then Rivers looked back at the two officers. "Before either of you leaves this building, I need 3 things. The CCTV footage from this hallway covering today, the recording of the 911 call that brought you here, and official written documentation of this incident, including your badge numbers, the call log, and everything that was said and done in this hallway today." Whitaker nodded once, the nod of a man who knows that he is already standing in the wreckage of something he cannot repair. Rivers picked up his box from the hallway floor, carried it into apartment 4C, and closed the door behind him. He had a move to finish. Malcolm Rivers spent the rest of Saturday finishing his move. The furniture arrived in the afternoon. The moving company brought everything up, and by evening, Rivers was sitting in his new apartment, surrounded by boxes he hadn't unpacked yet, with the folder of ownership documents on the kitchen counter, and 3 specific items on his phone: the CCTV footage, the 911 call recording, and the incident documentation he had requested from Whitaker and Barrett before they left the building. He listened to the 911 call once that evening. He watched the hallway footage once, then he put his phone down, made himself dinner, and went to bed. Monday morning, Rivers arrived at the Houston Police Department headquarters at 7:45 a.m. in full chief's uniform. He greeted the desk officers, shook hands with the administrative staff who had been expecting him, and walked into his office for the first time. He sat behind the desk, opened the folder containing the CCTV footage, the 911 recording, and the incident report and reviewed everything one final time with the methodical attention of a man who had spent 22 years building cases. At 8 a.m. exactly, he called Whitaker and Barrett into his office. Both officers entered in full uniform, looking the way people look when they already know what the conversation is about, but are hoping the reality will somehow be softer than what they've been imagining since Saturday. Rivers waited until both men were seated before he said anything. Then he reached forward and pressed play on his laptop, without introducing it or explaining what they were about to hear. The 911 call played through the laptop speakers in the quiet office. Deborah Lane's voice came through clearly describing a suspicious black man in the building, and then the moment that made both officers go still. The dispatcher asking if the man had done anything threatening, and Lane's voice answering that no, he hadn't done anything. She just didn't think a black man should be living in the building. The call lasted 3 minutes and 14 seconds, and when it ended, Rivers pressed stop and looked at both officers. "That is the call you responded to," Rivers said. "A woman called 911 because a black man was carrying boxes. The dispatcher confirmed no crime had occurred. You arrived and you dismissed valid ownership documentation." Rivers paused. "Then you attempted to arrest me." Neither Whitaker nor Barrett spoke. Rivers reached forward and played 30 seconds of the hallway CCTV footage showing the moment he held up his deed and Whitaker dismissed it. The moment he offered the phone number and Whitaker refused, and the moment both officers stepped toward him to make the arrest before the badge came out, he closed the laptop. "I'm suspending both of you effective, immediately pending a full internal affairs investigation. You will surrender your badges and service weapons to the duty officer before you leave this building today. You will not discuss this matter with any colleagues or media. A formal investigation will determine next steps." Whitaker opened his mouth. Rivers held up one hand and Whitaker closed it again. "I'm not interested in explanations this morning," Rivers said. "Internal affairs will give you both the opportunity to explain. That's their job. My job right now is to make sure this is handled properly and completely." Both officers surrendered their badges and weapons that morning and left the building in plain clothes. Word moved through the department quickly, the way it always does when something significant happens on a chief's first day. And by mid-morning, every officer in the building knew that the new chief had arrived to find 2 of their colleagues suspended for trying to arrest him on Saturday while he was moving into his own home. Internal Affairs opened the investigation the same day and pulled both officers' personnel files. What they found in those files is what turned a story about one Saturday morning into something much larger. Whitaker had been on the force for 15 years and had accumulated 11 racial profiling complaints during that time. 9 of those complaints came from black residents who described being stopped, questioned, or detained without cause in situations where their documentation or explanation was dismissed in favor of a white person's account. All 11 complaints had been investigated internally and closed without meaningful discipline. 3 of them had notes from reviewing, supervisors describing Whitaker as a thorough and dedicated officer whose instincts had served the department well. Barrett had been on the force for 3 years and already had 7 complaints in his file. 6 came from minorities. 3 described situations remarkably similar to what happened in the Westbrook Apartments hallway. Barrett following a senior officer's lead in dismissing valid documentation from a black person while accepting a white person's contradicting account without question. Barrett's complaints had been closed with even less scrutiny than Whitaker's, largely because he was junior, and the complaints were attributed to his inexperience rather than his bias. But the investigation didn't stop with the officers. Rivers had instructed Internal Affairs to pull everything connected to the Saturday incident, including the building's full security history, and when investigators reviewed the 2 years of Westbrook Apartments camera footage, they found a pattern that made the investigation significantly larger than 2 officers with bad complaint histories. Deborah Lane appeared in the footage 114 times over 2 years. 41 of those appearances showed her in hallways or near the elevator in situations that had nothing to do with her own movements through the building. She was watching people. Specifically, she was watching black residents, following their movements with her eyes, positioning herself near the entrance when she saw them arrive. And in 12 documented instances, she was shown on camera, reaching for her phone immediately after a black resident passed her. The building management company was contacted and pulled their complaint records at Internal Affairs' request. Lane had filed 23 formal complaints over 12 years. 19 of them were against black residents. The complaints range from noise violations to claims of suspicious behavior to allegations of property damage, none of which had been substantiated on investigation. 3 black tenants had moved out of Westbrook Apartments within 6 months of sustained complaint campaigns by Lane, and 2 of them had left reviews on apartment listing websites mentioning a hostile neighbor who made them feel unwelcome and unsafe in their own home. Internal Affairs contacted all 3 former tenants. 2 agreed to speak. The first was a black woman who had lived in apartment 4B directly next to Lane's apartment for 8 months before leaving. She described Lane knocking on her door to complain about noise when she was watching television at normal volume, calling building management about her repeatedly, and standing in the hallway staring at her door on multiple occasions. She had filed 2 complaints with building management that were resolved with nothing more than a letter to Lane. She had left because the environment became too hostile to stay. The second former tenant was a black man who had lived in an apartment 4D for 4 months before Lane's complaint campaign made his daily life in the IX building so uncomfortable that leaving felt easier than fighting. He had not filed any complaints because he didn't believe it would change anything. Both of them, upon hearing what Lane had done to Rivers on Saturday, said the same thing in different words. They were not surprised. Rivers filed the civil lawsuit against Deborah Lane through his attorney on Wednesday, 4 days after the incident. The lawsuit cited racial discrimination, harassment, and the filing of a false police report motivated by racial bias. It sought $200,000 in damages. Lane was served the papers at apartment 4A on Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, someone had leaked the 911 call recording to a local news station. By Thursday evening, it was national news. By Friday morning, 40 million people had heard Deborah Lane's voice telling a 911 dispatcher that she was calling because a black man didn't belong in her building, and learned that the black man was the city's new police chief. The 911 call recording did what recordings of explicit racism always do when they reached the public. It removed every possible defense before the legal case had even fully begun. There was no footage interpretation required, no competing accounts to weigh, no ambiguity about intent. Deborah Lane's voice said exactly what she meant in plain language to a government dispatcher on a recorded line, and 40 million people heard it within 48 hours of it leaking to the media. Lane's attorney released a statement 2 days after the recording went public, saying his client had acted out of genuine concern for building safety and that her words had been taken out of context. The statement lasted approximately 6 hours before becoming unusable because there is no context in which telling a 911 dispatcher that you're calling because a black man doesn't belong in your building means something other than exactly what it sounds like. The attorney quietly stopped issuing statements after that. Rivers' attorney, meanwhile, was building a civil case that didn't need the 911 recording to win, but was significantly stronger because of it. The CCTV footage from Westbrook Apartments was submitted as evidence showing Lane's pattern of behavior over 2 years, 114 appearances in hallways and common areas, 41 of them involving surveillance of black residents, 12 showing her reaching for her phone immediately after a black person passed her. The footage was edited into a clear chronological sequence, and when Rivers's attorney showed it to the opposing counsel in a pre-trial meeting, Lane's attorney asked for a 10-minute break and came back recommending his client consider settlement. Lane refused to settle. She maintained that her actions were justified and that the footage was being misrepresented. That decision brought the case to trial and put her behavior in front of a judge and jury with the full weight of 2 years of documented surveillance. A recorded 911 call admitting racial motivation. 3 former tenant testimonies describing harassment campaigns that drove them from their homes, and the building management records showing 19 complaints filed against black residents over 12 years with 0 substantiated findings. The internal affairs investigation into Whitaker and Barrett concluded in 14 days. Both officers were fired. Whitaker's termination letter cited his 11 racial profiling complaints, his pattern of dismissing documentation from black residents in favor of unverified white accounts, and his conduct on Saturday, which the investigation concluded was a direct continuation of a pattern the department had failed to address for 15 years. Barrett's termination letter cited his 7 complaints in 3 years and his demonstrated willingness to follow a senior officer's racial profiling without exercising independent judgment or raising the professional concerns the situation clearly warranted. Both officers appealed their terminations through the police union. The union reviewed the CCTV footage of the hallway incident, read the combined 18 complaints against both officers, listened to the 911 call recording, and declined to pursue the appeals further. Even the union couldn't build any defense around hallway footage showing 2 officers trying to arrest their own chief after he produced legal ownership documents and offered a direct verification method. The 3 former black tenants who had been driven from the building by Lane's harassment campaigns filed their own civil claims against Lane and the building management company. The management company, facing evidence that Lane's complaint campaigns against black residents had been inadequately investigated for 12 years, settled both claims quickly and quietly, replaced the building manager who had handled Lane's complaints, and issued a formal apology to all affected former residents. What made Rivers's press conference the moment that cut through everything else was its simplicity. He stood at the podium in his chief's uniform and spoke for 4 minutes without notes. He described Saturday morning. He described carrying boxes. He described Lane telling him he didn't belong. He described showing 2 officers his deed and watching them choose Lane's word over his documentation. And then he said the line that every headline used the next morning. "I had a badge," Rivers said, his voice quiet and completely steady. "Most people don't, and I need this city to understand that what happened to me on Saturday has been happening to people without badges in this building for 12 years, and in buildings like this one across this city for much longer than that. My badge got me out of that hallway. It shouldn't have been necessary. The deed should have been enough. Being a human being carrying boxes into your own home should have been enough." He paused for 3 seconds and looked directly at the cameras. "It wasn't, and that is what we are going to fix." The room was silent after he finished speaking. No questions felt adequate to ask immediately after those words, and the reporters who had covered Houston for years wrote afterward that they couldn't remember a press conference where the silence after a statement landed harder than the statement itself. Lane watched the press conference from apartment 4A, knowing her trial was 3 weeks away, knowing the footage existed, knowing the recording existed, knowing that 3 people who had left the building because of her were going to sit in a courtroom and describe what she had done to them in detail. She had spent 12 years believing that the building's whiteness was something she was maintaining. She had spent 12 years filing complaints and watching black residents leave and feeling satisfied about it. And she had spent one Saturday morning telling a police chief he didn't belong somewhere he owned, and the entire structure of what she thought she was protecting had collapsed into a lawsuit, a national news story, and a courtroom date she couldn't avoid. Whitaker and Barrett were processed out of the department on the same day, handing in their equipment, clearing their lockers, and leaving a building they had worked in for 15 and 3 years, respectively. Whitaker stopped in the parking lot and sat in his car for 20 minutes before driving away. Barrett left without stopping. Neither of them had anything to say to the journalists waiting outside. The city had its answer to the question that Rivers's press conference had raised publicly, but that the evidence had been answering for weeks. This wasn't one Saturday morning, it was a pattern, and the pattern had a price that was about to be paid in full. Deborah Lane's civil trial began 3 weeks after Rivers filed his lawsuit and lasted 4 days. Her attorney had spent those 3 weeks looking for a version of events that could survive the 911 recording, the 2 years of hallway surveillance footage, the 3 former tenant testimonies, and the building management records, showing 19 complaints against black residents over 12 years. He didn't find one because it didn't exist. The trial was less a legal contest than a structured presentation of evidence against a woman who had told a 911 dispatcher her exact motivation in her own voice on a recorded government line. The 3 former tenants testified on the second day. The black woman who had lived in apartment 4B described 8 months of sustained harassment that made her feel like a trespasser in her own home every time she walked into the hallway. The black man from apartment 4 described 4 months of the same. A third former resident who had not spoken publicly before the trial described Lane standing outside his door on 3 separate evenings and calling building management to report him for noise while he was sitting quietly reading. All 3 of them described filing complaints that produced nothing and leaving because staying felt impossible. All 3 of them described looking at Rivers's story and recognizing their own. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and found in Rivers's favor on all counts: racial discrimination, harassment, and filing a false police report motivated by racial bias. Lane was ordered to pay $200,000 in damages. Her attorney immediately began discussing appeal options, and Lane dismissed him before he finished the sentence, which suggested she understood that appealing would only extend a story she needed to stop being part of. The financial consequences arrived from multiple directions simultaneously. Lane's employer, a mid-sized Houston real estate company, had been watching the story develop for 3 weeks before the verdict came in. They terminated her employment 2 days after the jury's decision, citing conduct incompatible with the company's stated values and the reputational damage her actions had caused. The termination was effective immediately with no severance. Lane had worked there for 9 years. The building management company, already facing the EOR, settled claims from 2 former tenants and the public scrutiny of 12 years of inadequate complaint handling, reviewed Lane's lease and found that her sustained campaign of harassment against residents constituted a violation of the building's conduct policy. They issued a lease termination notice 4 weeks after the trial verdict. Lane had 90 days to vacate apartment 4A, the apartment she had lived in for 12 years, and spent 12 years trying to keep black people out of. She moved out on a Tuesday morning with no one watching except the building security camera that recorded her carrying boxes to a moving truck. The same hallway, the same elevator, the same entrance where she had told Malcolm Rivers he didn't belong. She was gone before noon. Officer Sean Whitaker, 39 years old at the time of his termination, spent 4 months attempting to find law enforcement work in neighboring counties before accepting that his termination record and the public nature of his conduct had made him unemployable in the field. He took a job in private security at significantly reduced pay. His appeal to the police union had been declined. His pension was under review pending the outcome of a separate civil claim filed against him personally by a black resident who had been wrongfully detained by Whitaker in 2019 and had refiled their previously dismissed complaint after the Westbrook incident made the pattern undeniable. Officer Lucas Barrett, 31 years old, left law enforcement entirely after his termination and moved out of Houston within 2 months of being fired. He gave no interviews and made no public statements. His personnel file, now part of the public record of the investigation, showed 7 complaints in 3 years that should have triggered intervention long before a hallway in Westbrook Apartments ended his career before it properly began. The building management company's accountability extended beyond the settled tenant claims. A city housing authority audit triggered by the investigation reviewed their complaint handling procedures across all 12 of their managed properties and found similar patterns of inadequate response to harassment complaints in 3 other buildings. New mandatory procedures were implemented requiring independent review of all tenant harassment complaints, automatic escalation when complaints against a single resident exceeded 3 in any 12-month period, and mandatory documentation of outcomes for all filed complaints. Rivers used his platform as chief to push through 3 specific reforms in his first year that he described publicly as direct responses to what happened on Saturday morning. The first required all officers to document their specific reason for doubting any identification or ownership documentation rather than simply stating it could be fraudulent, a direct response to Whitaker's refusal to call the number on the deed. The second created an independent civilian review panel for all racial profiling complaints, removing the internal process that had allowed Whitaker's 11 complaints and Barrett's 7 to be dismissed without consequence. The third established a community liaison program, placing officers in direct regular contact with the neighborhoods they patrolled with accountability measures tied to community feedback rather than arrest numbers alone. Complaint rates for racial profiling in the Houston Police Department dropped 47% in Rivers's first 2 years as chief. Use of force complaints dropped 31%. The department's relationship with black communities in the city, damaged by years of exactly the behavior that Whitaker and Barrett's files documented, began the slow and difficult work of rebuilding on a foundation of actual accountability rather than the appearance of it. 5 years after moving day, Malcolm Rivers was still Houston's police chief. The reforms he implemented in his first year had become models referenced by police departments in 4 other major cities. Deborah Lane was living in a different part of Houston, employed in a different industry, permanently attached to a 911 recording that had been heard by tens of millions of people and was still used in fair housing training programs and civil rights seminars as one of the clearest recorded examples of someone stating their racial motivation without ambiguity. The recording never stopped circulating. It never would. The $200,000 judgment sat on Lane's financial record as a permanent consequence of one Saturday morning when she decided to tell a man he didn't belong somewhere he owned. The moving boxes were unpacked. The chief was in his office, and the hallway where she made her stand was just a hallway now, with nothing in it except the building cameras that had recorded everything, and the knowledge that the woman who spent 12 years deciding who belonged there had been the one asked to leave. If this story showed you that racism in housing is systematic and deliberate, and that the people who practice it depend on silence and inadequate consequences to keep operating, share it with everyone who needs to understand that accountability changes systems and silence protects the wrong people. What protections would prevent neighbors from weaponizing complaints and 911 calls against black residents for years without consequence? Drop your answers in the comments and tell us what housing reforms matter most to you, and if you believe coming home should never require a badge to prove you belong there. Subscribe, because we are bringing you more stories where the truth dismantles what racism spent years building and justice arrives exactly where it is needed most.
We appreciate you tuning in. If this breakdown helped you understand the situation better, remember to like, share, and subscribe to Justice Insight Cam. Stay aware, stay protected, and we will see you next time.